Hello and welcome everyone to the first episode of the Off the Charts Football Podcast presented by Fantasy Insiders. I'm Spratt. I work for Sports Info Solutions. Joining me, as will be joining me every week for the rest of the football season, is Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders, who really needs no introduction. Welcome, Aaron.
Hey, I need an introduction because otherwise people will not know what voice this is, and they'll say, I have no idea who that person is.
Well, that seems totally fair to me. It's a very exciting time. The football season is getting underway. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of what we'll be talking about on the podcast, let's talk a little bit about how this came about, Aaron. I think the interesting part for me is the name, Off the Charts. It's sort of a target, I guess, for us to have an Off the Charts podcast in terms of quality. But this is really about the data and how it is that you and people like us are doing exciting things on the analytical front. It all starts with the data. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about how you came to be, I guess, at Football Outsiders with the charting you do and how that's working for us now?
Sure. First there were the dinosaurs, and slowly they evolved into man. And then I was born and started to like football. That's kind of how I came to be. But how I came to chart, when we started Football Outsiders a dozen years ago, we were primarily doing numbers that were just sort of context editing of the standard play-by-play. And I realized very quickly that in order to really get a good look at the game, we were going to need to get some items that were not on the play-by-play, not in the official play-by-play logs, things that were not officially tracked, like what were formations and defensive coverage and broken tackles and pass pressures that didn't necessarily lead to sacks. So for the last 10 years, we've used volunteers in the Football Outsiders game charting project, where we have charted all of these things in games. Now, the problem with this is that I'm not really in the data collection business. I have a lot of other things to do, like write articles and record podcasts and run DVOA numbers. And every year we would add more and more data we were trying to collect, and the collection process would just get bigger and bigger and bigger. So for this year, you and we have combined forces.
Exactly. So Sports Info Solutions, for those listening, might recognize us under the previous name of Baseball Info Solutions. We've been collecting data since we were founded in 2002. This actually goes back even earlier to John DeWan and Bill James' days at Project Scoresheet and then at Stats Inc. So I think we have a really exciting thing here going with Football Outsiders, Sports Info Solutions, and then with Fantasy Insiders as well, that'll be producing some high-quality charting collected data as well as great content. I know that Football Outsiders will be doing a weekly podcast on Fantasy Insiders as well. They'll be doing a column, right? I think I'm getting these details right.
Yes, we don't have the details yet about the doing podcast appearances, but yeah, we're going to be doing guest appearances for Football Outsiders writers talking about daily fantasy on Fantasy Insiders, and we're writing a column. Vincent Verhey is writing a column every week about daily fantasy and for FanDuel and the best values. And I know that some of the SIS charting data is going to be used by Fantasy Insiders, and it's also going to be used by Football Outsiders and give us charting data that we're going to have much sooner during the season so that we can talk about it during the season rather than just waiting for the off season and waiting for our book. And I think that's sort of from where we got the name of the podcast, which is that we're hoping to talk about a lot of things that we learn off the charts.
Exactly. We'll be talking about all that stuff right here on this weekly podcast. Aaron, it's obviously a very exciting time of the year for us, obviously for our businesses. It's exciting because football is starting. It's exciting for me, though, as sort of a stat junkie, because you just released the preseason DVOA updates, updated from your almanac that you do every summer. And there were some really interesting things, I think, in the update that we want to talk about today. Let's start with Green Bay, because just at a glance, it looked like they were one of the significant fallers in DVOA expectations. They actually dropped from a 60% playoff expectation to a 50% expectation since the middle of the summer. So there's a lot potentially there, but on the outside looking in, it seems like this is related to Jordy Nelson specifically. Is he the major reason that the Packers are projected to do much worse than they were previously?
Indeed, and I should point out that much worse is still better than almost any other team in the league.
Yeah,
I mean, Green Bay is still projected with the number one offense. They're still projected as the fourth best team overall. and they still have the number 5 odds of winning the Super Bowl. It went down from 4 to 5. They were passed by Indianapolis. But yeah, it's all because of Jordy Nelson, and it does sort of demonstrate some of the issues with trying to create an objective projection system. So one of the big changes in the projection system this year was a much more specific way of measuring the impact of adding or subtracting specific players from the team. And on offense, the way that we did that was by using the last year's DYAR numbers for all of the skill positions, quote-unquote skill positions, other than quarterback. We actually tried playing around with approximate value from Pro Football Reference, which is what we used on defense, but we found that DYAR ended up being a more accurate predictor. The problem is that the wide receiver DYAR is in some ways tied in with the quarterback and with the player's role in the offense. And so, Jordy Nelson has been second in DYAR for like 3 straight years among wide receivers. So if you take him out of the Green Bay offense, their projection is going to drop a lot because there are very few skill players in the league who've put up a DYAR number higher than Jordy Nelson over the last couple of years. But you ask yourself, how much of that is that it's Jordy Nelson who's that good, and how much is that it's Aaron Rodgers who helps make that happen?
So that's exactly what I was thinking about specifically is that you remember a player like James Jones. He was tremendously productive, at least by traditional stats like touchdowns, in Green Bay's offense. He leaves there and falls apart completely, and you're wondering whether Aaron Rodgers just basically creates stars. And now that Jones is back on the team, he'll plug and play, and it'll be totally fine. But it sounds like the DVOA and DYAR numbers are recognizing that Nelson himself is a tremendous player, and he's helping Rodgers as much as Rodgers is helping him.
Yeah, well, certainly. So here's the first thing: is certainly Jordy Nelson's DYAR is much higher than anything that James Jones ever put up in the same offense. I mean, I think if I look it up for the moment, that I'll be able to tell you just how much higher that it is. Last year, Nelson had 402 DYAR, which was second among wide receivers. The year before, Nelson was 17th because he was injured for part of the year, but he was 6th in DVOA. So he was still as good on a play-by-play basis. So Jones was good. His high is around 280 when he was with the Packers, 240 or so in 2011, 280 in 2012. That's good, but not as good as what Jordy Nelson has done the last 3 years. And it's, there's also that sort of the domino effect of Jones, Devontae Adams replaces Nelson, Jones replaces Devontae Adams. Now you have to if you use a fourth receiver, you're using Ty Montgomery more, and so on and so forth. But it's possible we want to look in the future years into whether we need to adjust the wide receiver numbers that are part of this for the quarterbacks before we try to account for gaining or losing wide receivers. And we did that a little bit with Kelvin Benjamin. Kelvin Benjamin's DYAR last year was basically 0, but we ended up counting him as 100 because we felt that given his role in the Carolina offense, that clearly that they're losing something when they lose him for the season, and that the 0 DYAR is caused in large part by forcing him the ball when he was covered, so there were lots of incompletions. So instead, we penalized them based on the idea that they were losing a player that did have a little bit of value. And I think that in the coming off season, after the 2015 season is over, we're going to analyze this a bit more and hopefully get an even more accurate view of this for when we do our projections in 2016.
Okay, that's pretty exciting. But as you said, I think the major takeaway here is that Green Bay is still projected to be one of the best teams in the league. But even so, a 50% chance of making the playoffs means that there's a 50% chance that they won't make the playoffs. So I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on what teams in the NFC North might actually be the potential contenders there. I think there are two major teams that are exciting in that respect. One is the Lions, who obviously had a great year last year, especially on defense. They were the third-ranked DVOA team last year, but they lose Ndamukong Suh, who obviously is such a huge name, got a ton of money in free agency to go to the Dolphins. Does losing him, does that take away from their chances, the Lions' chances of making a push for the division?
Well, I'll say first of all, as far as Green Bay's 50% chance of making the playoffs, some of that is just endemic to doing football projections. With only 16 games, with injuries playing such a large role, when you analyze, the last dozen years, you find that there's so much randomness and variation that all the best teams have a lower chance of making the playoffs than you think they would. We don't have a single team this year with over an 80% chance of making the playoffs. And we have only 2 teams with over a 62% chance of making the playoffs, and that's Seattle and New England. Mm-hmm. Every other team in the league finished out of the playoffs in at least a third of our simulations. It's just how the NFL is. There is a lot of randomness. I will say there does seem to have been less randomness in the last couple of years than there was a decade ago. So it's possible that we're overestimating the randomness based on what life was like in 2005 and 2006. But that's part of the reason why that number is so low. Meanwhile, Detroit's at 37%, and we have Minnesota at 39.5%. I do think that losing Sue is a big deal for Detroit, but the other thing to remember is the plexiglass principle, the famous Bill James idea that a team that dramatically improves from one year to the next will tend to decline the year after, and a team that dramatically drops from one year to the next will tend to improve the year after. And so Detroit was 14th in defense in 2013. When you combine the plexiglass principle with standard regression towards the mean, both of those items would suggest that Detroit is not going to be third, even if they had kept Sue. Then when you adjust for the loss of Sue, that's not as big as you think it is because you add Haloti Ngata, and the adding of Haloti Ngata makes up about half the value of the loss of Sue in the projection system. But, when you combine that with the regression and everything, that's how we end up in 10th.
Well, then I may be getting a little dangerous here because the stat that I wanted to bring up was that the Vikings went from being the 30th rated DVOA team in the first half of last season to the 12th in the second half. And I see that, and the first thing that comes to mind is that Teddy Bridgewater is maturing with the experience that he's getting in the league, and he's a player that I'm very excited about, and I feel like if he plays well, the Vikings can play well. But am I getting into trouble breaking it down that much? You're kind of mentioning with the Lions that even based on their full season success last year, that might not be enough to draw really clear conclusions about how great they are on defense. Is it too much to break down the season for the Vikings that way, or do you maybe see a similar trend and expect the Vikings? I mean, you said that they had the second highest in the division chances of making the playoffs by DVOA.
Yeah, this is the classic battle between common sense and statistical record. Because if you look at the statistical record from the past dozen years, there's no indication that teams that improve in the second half of the season carry that over to the following season. It's remarkable because common sense says that, especially if you're talking specifically about a young team, common sense says second half improvement should carry over. And yet, when you look in general, there's no indication. And when you look at quarterbacks, the Vikings chapter of Football Outsiders Almanac 2015 has a table showing rookie quarterbacks and how they played in the first half of the season compared to the second half of the season. And if you look at guys who improved in the second half of the season, there are just as many guys who failed in their careers as there are guys who succeeded in their careers, and vice versa. Bridgewater improved in the second half of his rookie year. So did Robert Griffin.
Yeah, exactly.
So did Blaine Gabbert. So did Vince Young. So did Chris Weinke. Meanwhile, Blake Bortles got worse in the second half of his rookie season. But so did Andrew Luck. And so did Cam Newton. And so did Ben Roethlisberger. So what do we learn from this? It's really difficult. But the common sense says that the Vikings should be better because they improved in the second half. And what's interesting is that what the numbers come out with from the projection system is that the defense improves, but the Vikings offense is projected to be about what it was over the course of the entire year, even when we credit them for the return of Adrian Peterson. What it likes about the defense is that defense has added so much young talent in the last couple of years, but that talent is still in a really sweet spot of being right at its peak value. The young guys have been added to guys who are veterans. there's a lot of second, third year good defensive players, and it looks at those variables regarding age in the roster, and it really likes that defense.
Interesting. So I think there are quite a few people out there sort of sharing my thoughts that the Vikings could be a surprising team this year. But the team that stood out to me as being the biggest narrative sleeper might be the Miami Dolphins, who obviously added Sue in the offseason, as well as making some high-profile draft picks like Devontae Parker. So they added a lot to the team and could be very exciting. But I noticed that in DVOA, they're not rated very well at all. They're actually behind teams like the Jets and Bills in their own division, like the Panthers, and expected number of wins this season. So I wanted you to touch on that. Is there any reason in particular why you don't like the Dolphins more in the DVOA standings?
Yeah, and the Dolphins were a really interesting team because when we did our sort of quick and dirty, quote unquote, easy projection for ESPN that I do in May, we actually had the Dolphins as one of the top contenders in the entire conference. So what changed between May and July? Because nothing really changed with the Miami roster. What changed was the projection system, and it changed in a couple of ways. The first is that the offensive projections now do more to look specifically at the quarterback, and the offensive projections are looking at 3 years of data, whereas those quick and easy projections that I did in May were just looking at 1 year of data with standard regression towards the mean. And the Miami offense leaped forward last year. And so the system now looks at the way Miami's offense leaped forward and says, this is not necessarily something that is sustainable, especially because the leap forward came in primarily in the running. In 2013, Miami was 18th running and 20th passing by DVOA. Last year, they were second in the league running and 11th passing. So that jump from overall 18th to overall 8th in offense, the system doesn't expect to maintain. The other big change is injuries. I have not written about this because it goes so against common sense that I feel like it needs more research. But one of the big takeaways with the new projection system is that injuries in 1 year don't seem to have any predictive value whatsoever for how well a team will play the following year, except for when it comes to the best players on the team, particularly the quarterback. If you look at just general adjusted games lost, when Bill Barnwell first came up with adjusted games lost a few years ago, he found not only did adjusted games lost do a good job of explaining part of why a team was better or worse than expected in a given year, but the change in injuries from 1 year to the next helped predict how well a team would play in the third year after that. I don't know whether we've changed the way we calculate adjusted games lost or the league has just changed over the last 5 or 6 years, but we found no such correlation in building this new system. So in May, we were giving Miami credit for the fact that they had a lot more injuries on both sides of the ball in 2014 than they had in 2012 or in 2013 or than the average team has. But now we're not giving them credit for that anymore, and so they fall in the projections.
That's interesting. Have the changes with the Patriots, obviously they've had a lot of high profile, both on the field and off the field changes to their team. Has that affected things at all, or has that really, in the net of things, sort of stayed the same from 4 months ago till today?
Well, I think in the last couple months, obviously in the book, we ran simulations. Some of our simulations represented things with Jimmy Garoppolo as the quarterback in the first 4 weeks, and some of them with Brady. Now they're all Brady. But we are now penalizing them a little bit for the Brandon LaFell missing the first part of the season. And so kind of surprisingly, the Patriots aren't that much higher in our new simulation than they were in the simulation that penalized them for not having Brady in the first 4 weeks of the season. It's a little weird. Their DVOA rating is much higher with Brady than it would have been with Garoppolo. I don't think I need to explain that. But in terms of actual expected wins, it didn't end up that much higher. I think part of that might just be because of the way that we had to do this. The simulation on the website does not specifically account for Pittsburgh's missing offensive players that are specifically missing just early in the season,
right?
Particularly Le'Veon Bell in the first 2 weeks. And I think that there might have been a small, that hurt the projections for New England and San Francisco, because those are the two teams that in the book were getting the benefit of playing Pittsburgh in those 2 weeks. And in reality, they get the benefit of playing Pittsburgh in those 2 weeks. The thing about the Patriots' projection is a week from now, this argument doesn't matter, because when we do playoff odds after week 1, the Patriots will have already played the Steelers, and that'll either be a win or a loss,
sure.
and we can all move on with our lives.
That makes sense. If the Dolphins are sort of the negative end of the spectrum of surprise for the casual fan, for me, I think it's the Rams that would be the opposite end of that. They were actually the 5th highest rated DVOA projection in the updated rankings there. That really stands out to me. Obviously, they're a team that has had middling at best success in recent seasons, but given the fact that they play in the NFC West, where Seattle has been so dominant and the 49ers have previously been so dominant, have they just been a good team that has sort of fallen to bad circumstances, or is this a team that you think has gotten a lot better?
Yeah, I was really surprised by this one too. Now, some of it is that, projections get very grouped together, except at the extremes, in the preseason because of the range of possibilities. And, in the book, the 4 teams that we had at the top of the league, there was a big space between them and everyone else. And now with Green Bay falling back a little bit, now the space is between the top 3 teams and everyone else. The top 3 teams being Seattle, New England, Denver. But the idea of St. Louis as a good team kind of makes sense. What they've been over the last 3 years is an average team with a hard schedule. St. Louis was 15th in DVOA in 2012, 14th in 2013, and 18th in 2014, despite playing a backup quarterback every year. So what the system sees is good special teams, which is, the projected based on the quality of the punter and the returns over the last couple of years. And special teams are hard to project, which is why the special teams projection does not add a lot of value. But it does say they'll have above average special teams. And a very good defense, because they've taken that defense that had so much talent and was top 10 the last couple of years and added even more talent to it. And an average offense, because they now have a starting quality quarterback rather than a backup quality quarterback, even if we don't think he's a really good quarterback. Even if Nick Foles is just as good as he was in Philadelphia last year, that should give St. Louis an average offense.
Yeah, because, from the outside, you might just say that, Sam Bradford is much better than Foles, but it's not like the Rams have actually had Sam Bradford to play over the last few years. You're really talking about Foles as an addition over the backups that the Rams have been using.
That's right. What you're comparing here is Foles to Austin Davis, Sean Hill, and Case Keenum, not Foles to Sam Bradford. And when you make that comparison, I think that even people who think that Foles' year in 2013 was a complete mirage would say that Foles is a better quarterback and that there is improvement there. Now, the reason why I personally think that the Rams projection is a bit off base, when we do our staff predictions article on Thursday, my prediction for team that I think is rated too high is going to be the Rams. And it's because the new projection system doesn't do a good job, I think, of looking at inexperienced offensive lines. The reason is, I guess, a lot of inexperienced offensive lines have played with top quarterbacks. And so when we did regression analysis, we didn't find any penalty for having a really inexperienced offensive line. I was kind of surprised. There's only benefit for having a really experienced line. There's no penalty for having a really inexperienced line. But the Rams line is really, really inexperienced. And I think that because of that offensive line, I think it's more likely that the Rams offense is bad, not terrible, but below average rather than average. And that would make the Rams more of an 8-8, 9-7 team, not a 10-6, 11-5 team.
Yeah, the Almanac goes into really great detail about that. And another sort of side of that equation for me is that Todd Gurley, it seems like the type of power feature back that makes sense on a team that wants to build their success around running and defense. Obviously, a formula that doesn't work a ton in the modern game, but has worked in some instances. With Gurley hurt, and in fact with Trey Mason hurt, how much does that hurt them in the early part of the season?
A little bit, but I mean, our projections don't usually base things based on running backs very much. I mean, the skill position value, variable that's in there now will penalize teams that lose a good running back. And, Dallas is penalized for losing DeMarco Murray, and the new projections penalize Houston for Arian Foster not playing for part of the year. But a lot of the value for players is in receiving. I mean, one of the reasons why Pittsburgh's projection would be hit so bad in just the first 2 weeks is Le'Veon Bell as a receiver, not just Le'Veon Bell as a runner. So, I mean, I think it hurts what the Rams want to do, but I've always been a believer, and Football Outsiders has always been, putting forward the idea that the offensive line is more important in run blocking than people credit it for, and not as important in pass blocking as people credit it for.
Well, let's move on to the division that I both love and hate, the NFC South. The South has a bit of a history of teams going worst to first, and that's really not that hard to imagine given the mediocrity, I guess, at the top of the division last season. But DVOA in particular likes both Atlanta and New Orleans. And the reason that stands out to me is that both teams are so skewed towards the offense. And in fact, they were 32nd and 31st in defensive DVOA last season. So I'm curious, how much of this is about what you've been talking about, how defensive DVOA is a lot less consistent than offensive DVOA. So teams that have sort of, I guess, lucked into, or the lack of consistency has helped their defenses turn around more quickly than offenses do. How much of it is about schedule? Obviously, those teams with those poor finishes last year get to play easier teams, and they get to play each other in the NFC South. And how much about it is actually about improvements on the roster?
Well, I will say that the schedule thing is no longer about what place you're in for the most part, because since 2002 and the setup that had 4 divisions, only 2 games on your schedule are determined by your place in the standings the year before. Schedule strength is much more about which division you play in the rotating schedule each year. That's why schedules tend to be grouped together by division. The 2 easiest schedules projected in the league this year belong to New Orleans and Atlanta. Tampa Bay is 27th and Carolina is 23rd. So what matters is the divisions that the NFC South plays against, particularly the AFC South, rather than which place they came in, although it matters a lot in this case because Carolina, by finishing first, I believe earned games with Seattle and Green Bay, whereas Atlanta and New Orleans get to play weaker teams from those. I mean, the Rams are, I think, going to be good, and the Vikings and Detroit should be good, but still that's not like playing Green Bay and Seattle. So Carolina got a little screwed in that way. I am also, by the way, let me just say I'm kind of proud that we're doing this, that I get to do this with you. For people who don't know you and only know me, one of the problems at Football Outsiders has always been the lack of voices from the NFC South, and you are a North Carolina man.
Yeah, pride. I'm that one guy that's a Panthers fan that's out there for sure.
So we are going to be getting to talk a lot more NFC South than I'm used to talking to, and it's really kind of a fun division. Bad defenses are kind of fun. I mean, it's kind of fun. You've got Cam Newton is fun. He's a fun guy to watch. You've got 2 really good quarterbacks, and then you've got can Jameis Winston prove our projection system wrong? I think the NFC South is a fun division. That being said, I mean, Atlanta and New Orleans. See, here's the thing. The best offenses are usually projected to be better than the best defenses, and the worst offenses are usually projected to be worse than the worst defenses. This year is actually a bit of an exception because Seattle's defense has a better projection than any offense after the Jordy Nelson injury. But the worst offenses are projected much worse than the worst defenses because there's so much variation possibility with defense. So even though we have Atlanta and New Orleans projected 30th and 31st in defense, those defense, the average expected defense from those teams is about what like the 10th best offense would be, because when we think that a defense is going to be really bad, it could be kind of average, like last year's Cowboys. You just don't know. There's too much variation. Yeah. But what you do know is that the offenses for those teams should be good. I mean, the Saints have a good, consistent offensive line that just added a really good player at center. And Ben Grubbs was not as good as some people think that he left. Drew Brees does good things with a good offensive line. Unger hopefully helps the running game, helps them control those blitzes up the middle. That helps make up for the loss of Jimmy Graham. There should still be a strong offense there. And there should be a strong offense in Atlanta where Matt Ryan is an excellent quarterback. So when you combine the strong offenses with the two easiest schedules in the league, you end up with two teams that are projected to be average teams that get into the playoffs because of easy schedules.
Yeah, and that defensive volatility I find really interesting because I feel like it's kind of coming from many different places. The schedule, obviously, but like you mentioned with the Cowboys last year, in a lot of ways their defensive success seemed to me to be a product of how successful their offense was, especially running the ball and controlling clock. That limited the amount of time the defense had to be on the field and get them good field position. The thing with the Saints specifically a few years ago, when they made their Super Bowl run, they had a crazy number of turnovers that they forced, and that's something that I feel like is a pretty random thing. Do you not agree?
Oh, totally.
So that's something that even the defense with terrible personnel, if they ended up in the season where they forced a lot of turnovers because of that just random nature of things, that could turn them into a much better performing defense than the actual talent on the team, right?
Oh, I'm sorry. Were you talking about the 2014 Dallas Cowboys? I'm trying to remember.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
a better
exactly
recent
what
example.
happened
Yeah.
with the Cowboys. Cowboys led the league in turnovers per drive, and that is what made their defense slightly below average instead of really bad. But, giving up yardage is much more consistent from year to year. But turnovers play a huge role in the quality of defense and, getting off the field and getting your offense back on, even though there is, luck and variation involved in them. Not necessarily luck. Variation is not necessarily luck. It can just be unexpected good plays, the opportunity to make unexpected good plays. It also seems that other than the position of quarterback, injuries on defense have a bigger impact than injuries on offense. And also, I think part of it is just that the quarterback controls the game so much. Brian Burke, late of advanced NFLstats.com and now of ESPN Stats and Information, likes to say that football is kind of a weird combination of an individual sport and a team sport because the quarterback has so much impact on the offensive side of the ball. Now, it's not as much impact as a lot of people believe because there's still defense and special teams and the quarterback has no impact on those things. But on the offensive side of the ball, the quarterback has so much impact. I think that's a big reason why offense tends to be more consistent than defense. And it even goes farther than just these projections. The Green Bay chapter, we talk about that if you only look at the teams with the best quarterbacks in the league, that they tend to see a lot less regression towards the mean after their best seasons than other teams that go, when a team goes 11-5, 12-4, 13-3, historically there's going to be regression towards the mean likely, but that regression is a lot less likely in the last dozen years if those teams employ Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, Drew Brees, Aaron Rodgers, or Phillip Rivers. And Matt Ryan is probably the next guy on that list, either him or Roethlisberger. So that's one of the things that keeps offense consistent, and that's one of the things that means that it makes Atlanta and New Orleans dangerous this year because you combine those consistent, strong offenses with easy schedules.
That all definitely makes sense.
I will say everything is set up this year. Dangerous is probably the wrong word because everything is set up for Atlanta to play that historical role of the team that surprisingly gets the number 2 seed and loses their first game.
Well, let me just serve the role of the biased host here and say that maybe in a few weeks we'll circle back on how well the Falcons are actually playing. But it definitely is interesting. I do feel like that division is very much up in the air, maybe more so than any other division. Well, Aaron, I'm very excited about watching all the football this weekend. Are there any other major things that you wanted to talk about before we call it our first episode?
I think we've hit pretty much most of the projections. I think the one surprising one to some people is Arizona that we didn't talk about. But if you're a Football Outsiders reader or anyone who follows advanced stats in any way, you already know that Arizona was not as good as its record last year. And you're not surprised by the fact that we project them to be among the biggest losers in the league this year because they have the hardest projected schedule and the team is just not as good as people thought last year. That being said, they also lost more defensive talent than people realize. But there's the Bruce Arians problem, which is that Bruce Arians, has a history of outperforming expectations and outperforming Pythagorean, the win expectations based on just points scored and allowed and winning close games. I have a feeling that whether that continues this year is going to be the subject of conversation on this podcast multiple times during the season.
Absolutely. Well, thanks to everyone that discovered the first episode of our new Off the Charts NFL podcast. Hope everyone enjoyed it. I think with the new situation we have worked out here with Football Outsiders, Sports Info Solutions, and Fantasy Insiders, we'll actually have some much quicker turnaround on things like DVOA updates that'll, I think, make this podcast really exciting with a lot of things to talk about in the coming weeks.
Yeah, the charting data, it's getting the charting data updated, things like cornerback coverage numbers and pass pressures and broken tackles on a regular basis during the season, and then being able to do DVOA for that, DVOA by certain formations, play action versus non-play action during the season that previously I could only do after the season, really excites me. And I do want to encourage listeners to, first of all, check out Fantasy Insiders, who have a lot of really great content for playing in the daily fantasy space, and to tell their friends about this podcast, because it's not going to show up in the iTunes podcast app for like a week, because that's kind of how that works.
Yeah.
So if you're wondering where to find it, you've got to have to wait a week or so to find it. But tell your friends about it to come and find it on Football Outsiders, because it's good and we're going to get better and we're going to ask you to ask us questions and we're going to answer them for you and we're going to have a lot of fun talking football.
Yeah, you can feel free to yell at me about that whole situation, because in addition to co-hosting, I'm trying to be the producer of the show. So
I'm not yelling
all
at you,
problems
I'm
are
yelling
on
at
my
Apple.
shoulders.
They're the ones who think that $100 is a good price for a pencil.
Exactly. All right, well, thanks so much, Aaron. I think that was successful. Enjoy the first week of games, and we'll circle back next week to talk about week 2.
All right, bring on the football.